I had read the inspiration for Django, though I don't necessarily believe it. By all accounts that I read, Bass Reeves was a very well-spoken and polite person, overly kind to everyone he met. Django didn't give a fuck.
Django was awesome.
Welcome back to Shat on TV Watchmen, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Watchmen. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my two co-hosts, the King Bee.
No mob justice today. Trust in the law.
And Roger Roper.
I've got a nose for white supremacy, and you smell like bleach.
And this is our deep dive episode where we look back on this week's episode of Watchmen and provide our thoughts and analysis, plus the top listener email for the week. This week's episode was entitled It's Summer and We're Running Out of Ice. Guys, now that we've had 24 hours to think about it, digest it, rewatch in some cases, what do you think?
Yeah, I couldn't help but evangelize this show to everyone I spoke today. In my meetings, you know how it is when you go back to corporate America after a weekend and it's Monday morning and people are like asking you what you did. I really had nothing other than to say, have you watched Watchmen? Like, and I kind of felt bad because I work for kind of like an active company that does a lot of hiking and going out. And I did nothing but like sit on my couch last night and watch Watchmen, not once, but twice immediately after we recorded the Instacast. I was so jazzed about it. In fact, my lady friend Kelly came, she stayed the night and she helped me pick out like those little Easter eggs and topics for the show. She even let me read before Watchmen in lieu of making awkward night owl Silk Spectre sex. So all in all, I mean, a phenomenal kickoff. And I haven't been this jazzed for a series in a long time. And I love it.
So were people at your office actually aware of Watchmen before you brought it up? or were you just like, hey, did you watch Watchmen? Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
It's the same reaction that we got like when we said that we had a Westworld podcast. Like, I feel this is going to be a similar trajectory. I feel like the first couple of weeks, there's only going to be people who are nerds and have HBO. And then I think it's going to slowly sleep into the mainstream. In my first meeting, my client, she's like, yeah, I heard about this show Watchmen and I gotta go and check it out. Everyone's talking about it. So yeah, I think it's that water cooler show that we've been looking for.
I saw it referenced today online as HBO's flagship program. And I was like, ooh, that worries me a bit because with Game of Thrones, I would get to the office after we do a recording and be annoyed when people ask me about Game of Thrones. I'm like, ah, shit. You know, I'm more interesting than that, guys. I'm not just the Game of Thrones guy. With Watchmen, I haven't been back to the office yet. I'm still on vacation, but I go back tomorrow. I don't think anybody's aware of this show. I agree with you, Raj, and King B mentioned during the preview that it's going to be likely, 9 episodes and that's all she wrote. And I think that's when it's going to maybe catch on with people is once the whole thing is done.
Well, because I don't have any demands on my schedule, I'll sit and watch 4 seasons of a god-awful television show. My initial reactions are, yeah, it's fine. I'm not going to get really excited, but I didn't see anything that really bothered me. The production value is there. The cast is strong. You've got a rich source material. And I mean, there's a looming kick in the guts in this story. I can just feel it coming. It's going to be a great show.
When I was asked what I thought of the show immediately after it aired, I kind of took a cool response as well and said, well, I don't know. It could be good. It could be bad. It's really too early to say. Did it grip me the way that Game of Thrones did originally? No. Or Breaking Bad? No. Or even The Leftovers? No. It's not that kind of show. But the more I think about it, I thought about it all last night and all of today. The more I think about the Watchmen premiere, the more I like it. I was viewing it from the perspective of somebody doing a podcast on the show. And I felt like the show left viewers feeling completely lost because it didn't ease them into Lindelof's version of this world, right? We didn't get the setup, the rules, all that stuff. It was just like, there's squid falling out of the sky. This guy wears a mask and they're in the pod, things are happening. And then I realized that we're supposed to be watching something develop, not something continue. And I was looking at it as a continuation from Watchmen, the graphic novel. And instead, I should be looking at it as the beginning of something and not even try to relate it to anything old. So we can see Easter eggs. We can link to histories and go, oh, that's nice as a fan that there's that connection. But I don't think you need an understanding of that world to understand what's happening from here going forward. And I think we didn't get all the history on purpose, because we're supposed to be choosing sides. We're supposed to be forming opinions. We're supposed to be feeling as adrift in this universe as the characters themselves.
I think it's actually a testament to the storytelling that's taken place that we aren't given all the pieces to this puzzle. The first time those squids drop, the characters don't react with anything more than a mild annoyance. And I think that we as the viewers are supposed to react the same way. This is a world that we're citizens in, and we need to just accept what's going on around us as the norm, because that's how it is.
Very effective job of using visual cues like that and very strategic emoting without having to provide exposition to give the audience clues of how this universe operates. And again, that's all masterful storytelling and direct. And hats off to the director. Nicole Castle is the director of episode 1. She's done a lot of TV, Cold Case, The Closer, The Killing, Vinyl, and The Americans. Great job.
Speaking of storytelling, the scene that seems like to some people a throwaway of when Detective Abar is doing the Vietnamese food in the classroom, we learned so much from that. That again, you didn't need to see the first. You didn't need to see the first movie. You didn't need to see or read the graphic novel. You know that Vietnam is now a state. You know that Robert Redford is president. And all that setup is there just in this scene. There's a lot to be gleaned from that. And I think this is a show that gets better with a rewatch, much like Westworld. And also like Westworld, this show is a conversation starter more than a complete narrative. Like the real quality of it is that since it aired, I've had the opportunity to have conversations about white privilege, about government overreach, about poverty, about the appropriate role of police. Like, should police have to have their gun remotely unlocked in a situation? Should they have to get consent for things and record everything? And perhaps most profoundly, the opening scene educated us on at least the concept of the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. Whether it's completely accurate or not, there is some embellishment, I'm sure. People didn't know about this. We didn't know about this. And it opened up the gateway to that conversation. Our podcast, if you haven't listened to it before, on Shadow TV, we do things a little bit differently. So we're not going to take you scene by scene and break it down. We're not going to be on here for 90 minutes. What we will do is break the show down into buckets on our weekly deep dive every Tuesday. And essentially what we're going to do is go through and cover the big topics or the things that we found particularly interesting, did some research on and brought back to you. Also, we'll include email that is coming in from the listeners. You can go to hosts@shatontv.com and write us with topics you find interesting. And we will get to those in the podcast. And sometimes, as is the case today, we actually will use that as a driver for some of the content that we're going to cover. And the first thing that I wanted to cover is the Tulsa Race Riots.
Yeah, I was immediately gripped by that opening scene. We see the young boy in the movie theater, and then suddenly there's a slow alarm, and you see what appears to be a bomb goes off. I started Googling because they give you a time and a place to start, and it's not hard to find a little bit of information on the Tulsa Race Riot. This is a terrifying tale, and I'm purposefully omitting names here. On May 31st, 1921, in a prominent African-American district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood District, it was known as the Black Wall Street. A young black man, he was arrested for a form of assault against a white woman. That evening, a white mob appears at the courthouse where he's being held, and they demand that he be released. They're going to take care of business their way. A group of about 75 African-American men, most of them, or a lot of them, were World War I veterans, actually came to support the sheriff against this demand for mob justice. A conflict ensues, and gunfire leaves 10 white men and 2 black men dead. Now, as I'm reading this, I see that and I just get sick to my stomach because you just know nothing good's going to come of that. It was horrible to even think about. The conflict continues through the night. And then at dawn on June 1st, white mobs raid the entire Greenwood district. They're setting fire to black-owned homes and businesses. They're opening fire in the streets against citizens. There are even multiple reports that include the use of machine guns, and there's an airplane attack that's dropping incendiary and explosive devices on top of this neighborhood. So in that scene, when you see the airplane flying overhead, that isn't some strange alternate history. By 9:15, the National Guard finally arrives and they start to institute martial law to sort of quell this riot. But by then, most of the neighborhood's already burned to the ground. A lot of survivors of this riot left Tulsa. Those who did remain stayed relatively silent about the entire event. In 1921, they report 36 deaths as a result of the riots. Many, many decades later, in 1996, a bipartisan governmental group researches the incident, and they believe that that figure could have been closer to 100 to 300 people killed in those riots. It's disgusting and unfathomable. It's a horrifying story. There are monuments out there that exist. There's a lot of information. I think that everyone owes it to themselves to read about this because this thing happened and then went completely untalked about for decades. So how does this fit into the Watchmen? As we stated in that preview episode, in this America, minorities are given this lifelong tax exempt status as reparations. They call them Redfordations as a derogatory term for having been the victim of racial violence. And this doesn't sit well with large portions of the population. And I think that seems to be the main motivation behind these Seventh Cavalry attacks that are going to feed most of the conflict throughout this show. I think that there's this theme of measures and countermeasures. The more people try to fix this system, the more violently the system is destructing. Gun control as a result in the modern day, police hiding behind masks, yet having to constantly ask for authorization. It's just this push and pull in society where nobody's really going to get what they want. We see, the antagonist of our show, maybe his old plan hasn't yielded the desired result, and this new plan is coming into fruition.
And again, I applaud Lindelof for taking something that is a really bad part of our history and kicking off a comic book show with it and getting people to talk about it.
It just is an idea of how different this show is from what we've typically been watching on HBO as far as like these blockbuster shows go. I was reading back at some of the email we got from Game of Thrones, and it was about why did the dragon burn the throne and melt the throne and not kill Jon Snow? And where did the dragon go? And and not to poo-poo that audience, but this is a very different show with some very different email in it. And so Ash Schlafly, one of our longtime listeners and contributors, wrote in a remarkable email to kind of set the tone for the type of conversation we're going to have with Watchmen. She's writing about the KKK and its connection to the Seventh Cavalry. And basically this idea that, the KKK in its original incarnation kind of hit its peak and then it died off a bit. And then it was brought back again in the early 20th century, in particular with, Birth of a Nation. And as they came about and reformed this KKK, the new symbols of the KKK, Bible, the sword, and the American flag. And one of the things is that new KKK is called an invisible empire. This is what Ash was writing in about for two reasons. One is that they hide behind masks as being invisible. They could be the guy that you see, at work, Raj. But also it's because they fear becoming invisible, right? That they fear losing their white identity or the concept thereof. And so Ash writes in, we see the same fear of invisibility today, or a fear of true marginalization. Many within the white community, both supremacists and not, express an exhaustion with being made to feel bad for being white, that white guilt is something that is both not their fault and that they should not be made to feel. These elites, and she says in quotes, in terms of privilege due to their skin color, did not understand their privilege or were unable to recognize it, turning their exhaustion with being labeled the oppressor into a pity party for themselves. And Ash says it's the very reason that Trump was elected. Unfortunately, for that subpopulation of the white race, he represented an end to that guilt, an end to a time of being made to feel bad for being the race that held the most power. And in truth, Trump empowered them to use that power to oppress in ways they felt ashamed to do before. He helped them move from being the invisible empire to the very visible, with their MAGA hats marking them and their ideology. And connecting that to the story, Ash says, like the KKK, the Seventh Cavalry is tired of feeling put upon. They bastardize the writings of Rorschach to serve their own needs. And their needs are hate, violence, and fear-mongering. And they're the invisible empire, this being the Seventh Cavalry. They're the invisible empire cloaked not in white, but the inked masks of their inspiration, their hero. And they're a reminder that racism is rampant, it's among us, and it's cloaked in many forms, but it is there and toxic. And I thought Ash did a wonderful job of really summarizing that connection.
And again, I got a lot of questions when I posted on Twitter, hey, what do you want us to talk about? And this was one of the topics. Why is Rorschach an inspiration for the Seventh Calvary? Well, in the comic books and movie, Rorschach is a daily reader of the New Frontiersman. And the New Frontiersman within the world of Watchmen is a 1980s conservative publication, typically containing articles espousing right-wing political and societal views. It also is typically on the side of costume adventurers, viewing them as protectors of the country. There's even a slogan in the books, and I think in the movies, there's vandalism that's in one of the scenes that says, "In your hearts, you know it's right." And then there's spray paint over that adds the word wing. Alan Moore is not just completely against right-wing extremism. I think what he tries to tell is a tale of there's extremism on both sides. And without balance, you're going to get fascism, or you're going to get, communism, which are both authoritarianisms. Again, if you were to tie this into, Rorschach at the end of the movie and the end of the comic book, he's kept a journal, kind of a manifesto, if you will, and he hands it off to the New Frontiersman. And the New Frontiersman, the editor and this beat writer are kind of in the office, and they're like, well, what do we do? We're out of business now in this new utopia. How can there ever be any kind of story, right? Because if all the worlds are coming together, there are no more enemies, then there's no spot for us. And then you see, and it goes to the close-up of Rorschach's journal. And if you think about that, historically, terrorist manifestos are always considered to be a documentation of that terrorist belief system, but it really is not. It's really just a story that highlights all about themselves. Most extremist movements believe their waking reality has become, dystopian, and they are participants in a cosmic war. And it's not just white nationalists. It's also jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This belief that is articulated as a war on Islam, or for anarchists and socialists, it's a fascist oligarchy controls free market societies. And in the case of white nationalism specifically, which we're exploring in the HBO series, the white race, again, as Ashley highlights here, is threatened with extinction. These manifestos aren't honest. They're really meant for mass consumption, right? Like Ted Kaczynski, like Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. They're not supposed to be factual or realistic as the inner worlds of their authors. They're supposed to be like prompting themselves up as heroes. And I think that's what Rorschach does in his journal, which makes sense. And it seems logical why the Seventh Calvary would worship a symbol like Rorschach or someone like that, because they've twisted the words in the manifesto to, draw inspiration for their movement, which ultimately at the end of the day just comes down to simple fucking ignorance.
I never felt reading Rorschach as I think he's an apolitical character. I don't think he had political leanings or even opinions. He was mentally unbalanced. He was an incredibly damaged individual. He was a loner, and I don't think that there was any sort of real manifesto. It was a diary that just detailed his grim sort of condemnation of modern society. The guy lived in a bad part of a bad town. He saw violence, he saw sex, he saw crime, he saw prostitution, and he condemned all those things. He had a Ayn Rand sort of viewpoint. Everything was black and white to him in the world. There was no extenuating circumstances for wrongdoing. If you were bad, you got the boot, and if you were good, you were protected. I don't think there was a lot of depth to it, and I think that it was meant to be that way. How it's been or why it's been co-opted by white supremacists, I'm sure it would be easy to make that jump, but I don't think it adds a ton of depth to this story.
You mentioned Ayn Rand. If you think of Atlas Shrugged, or you think of like Might is Right, a self-serving libertarian, survival of the fittest manifesto that, again, has been co-opted by the alt-right in today's world, it would make sense why the Rorschach figure. Again, if the question is, why is Rorschach, who a figure that a lot of people liked in the movie, a lot of people liked the fact that he would do no matter what. He would stop at nothing, and people got what they deserved. But is that truly justice? When you look at characters like Batman, is it crossing the line if you kill? In Batman, in the traditional comic book version of him, he was one that didn't want to cross that line because there was no coming back from that. And he had to separate himself from the two. And I think Night Owl is kind of that similar character.
I think if you really look at vigilantism, especially as it's displayed in the books, all of these characters are this might makes right sort of leaning ethos. They all fully embrace violence and beating the holy shit out of those who stand against you. I think Rorschach is just the most brazen and honest about it. Everyone else might stand behind some sort of reason or altruistic notion, but the fact of the matter is every one of these people did it because they enjoyed it and it excited them.
Getting back to the Seventh Cavalry, and especially with the idea that Ashley presented of them being connected to the KKK as at least an inspiration and function, if not a direct lineage, it begs the question of whether the Seventh Cavalry actually consider themselves racist, right? Or white supremacists, because we don't see really any activity in this opening episode that would indicate that they are necessarily, let's say, anti-black or white supremacists, right? Yes, they are white. Yes, they live in trailers. Yes, they have all the trappings of what we would think would be white supremacists. But their fight, largely, when you look at it, is their anti-establishment, and it's a poverty thing. It's a class warfare thing. And so when you look at it, what's their gripe, right? The Red Forations are the gripe. And so let's imagine there's an organization of people who are inspired by this journal that gets published in 1985 from this guy Rorschach, who's saying, look, a big sham was pulled on everybody. We thought this giant psychic squid came and caused mass destruction. And as a result, a new world order was placed into place and lives were saved. There was no thermonuclear war. But you guys were all fooled. This is not the truth. So you take that, you take a group that says, okay, we believe that. We think that we were fooled, that the rest of the world is operating under this false order. And we have chosen to arm ourselves. We've chosen to stand up for ourselves. The cops are wearing masks. We wear masks. Like, what's the difference? And we look at it from that perspective, you go, shit, we might be prejudging this group entirely.
No, we're not prejudging this group because it's already discussed in the episode that there was a white knight. Judd brings up why are these clowns coming up again? So again, this is a fringe of society that continues to wreak havoc upon a certain subset of the population, a minority of the population. This is not a group that we should try to make apologies for.
This is a group that is very much kind of left to fend for themselves. I would think that it's almost sort of a sovereign nation sort of concept that they're building on here. They're angry about Redfordations, which were reparations paid to minorities, and they all seem to be largely poor white people who have just been delivered the news that, hey, this whole setup for this new world order was just another scam by those who are in charge, who just arbitrarily get to choose who's going to benefit and who's not. Well, why aren't they benefiting? And since they're not benefiting, why don't they take the law into their own hands and build their own fortune?
So now that we've lost half the audience talking about the politics of the show, white supremacy, and all the things that were triggered by Ash's email and Raj's research, let's get back to what people really want to know about for this show, which is comic book characters. And one of the characters that we see throughout this episode, whether it's on the miniseries and advertise on the bus, something that we referenced in the preview episode and on our Instacast, was this name keeps coming up: Hooded Justice, Hooded Justice, Hooded Justice. King B, you are our resident comic book expert. Tell us about this character, Hooded Justice.
Okay, so Hooded Justice is just going to be a background figure. I don't think he's going to be central to this plot. I think that he is a person who at one time existed and now just isn't around in any sort of adventuring form. In the books, historically, he shows up in 1938 as one of the first costume adventurers. Later that year, when he shows up, he'll help form what is called the Minutemen, which are later named the Watchmen in the movie and in this show. He's described as a large, muscle-bound man with the physique of a wrestler. He's dressed in black with a red cape, and he's got that executioner's hood, and he wears a noose around his neck. In the books, it's suggested that possibly he's a German strongman, although it's never proven. It's just sort of supposition. Follow-up books that are meant to sort of enlarge and create depth to the origins, in my opinion, just further muddle the story about who he may have been. It's later said that when Congress demands that all these vigilantes reveal their identities, Hooded Justice refuses and opts to just retire or disappear. In the show, we see who I believe to be a young Will Reeves fixated on that old movie serial of the famous Bass Reeves, the first African-American deputy marshal west of the Mississippi. He's likely a relative, a grandson or such. And the young man, we see him clearly embracing the notion of law and order and aiding the weak when he says, "No mob justice today, trust in the law." The last time we see young Will Reeves, it's after the riots. He's the lone survivor of this horrible city leveling race riot. He's wandering down the dark road carrying the infant girl that he picks up off the ground. And that's the end of young Will Reeves as far as we know. We believe old Will Reeves shows up later. He's in a wheelchair. He's aware of Sister Knight's alter ego. He asks her if she believes he could lift 200 pounds. And then later he's going to show up with Don Johnson. In my opinion, the shortest path is that Will Reeves will become the hooded justice and later retire based on just his obsession as his youth with doing right and protecting the weak. If you want to get real comic booky as far as origins, maybe he wanders until he crosses paths with a traveling circus, taken in by circus folk, cared for by the strong man. Maybe he becomes a sidekick. Maybe he carries on for hooded justice after he retires. It's one of those wait and see sorts of things. But that's how I feel hooded justice is going to fit into this. Ultimately, it's historical color, but not really any meat pertaining to the story.
So, Kigby, you mentioned that quote from young Will Reeves when he's quoting Bass Reeves when he says, there'll be no mob justice today. Now, there's obviously a very dark irony to that statement. Is as soon as he says that, you see the Tulsa Race Riots 1921, and there certainly was a mob and there was no justice in that case. And so it draws us back to the opening of this series. We do get this film reel with Bass Reeves. And again, much like the Tulsa Riots, not something I knew was a real thing.
Yeah, Bass Reeves was actually a real American cowboy. He was born into slavery. He would later become the first African-American deputy marshal west of the Mississippi. They say in his career, he was said to have arrested 3,000 outlaws and killed 14 men in his career as a lawman, but only to defend his own life, he says. He escaped to slavery during the Civil War. He was rumored to have physically beaten up his owner over a card game. The dude runs north and lives amongst the American Indians for a few years, learning many languages and tracking skills. Later, he does become a deputy marshal. He fathers 11 children. At one point, he even has to, in the line of duty, hunt and arrest his own son for murdering his wife. His son would later be pardoned and remained a law-abiding citizen for the rest of his life, I read. Bass Reeves himself was charged with the murder of a posse cook. There's a lot to be said in this about, this pursuit of justice, this embracing of the law. Yet at the same time, there are many people in this story that kind of straddle the line between law and lawlessness. And ultimately, you killed to defend that line. The parallels between that and what we're going to see in this show, I think, are going to continue to be shown throughout.
In addition to that, I read somewhere, and it's all over, it's trending on Twitter right now, that Bass Reeves was the original inspiration. He's like the real Lone Ranger. And again, similar to Tulsa 1921, that's kind of been forgotten, especially when you, as you outlined, the Lone Ranger had Tonto, right? That was his sidekick, a Native American, and Bass Reeves went and lived amongst the Native American tribes out in the wild frontier. He's also the inspiration for Django Unchained.
Incidentally, the Green Hornet's great-great-grandfather was the Lone Ranger, historically speaking.
Now, Raj, some of the other research that you did was off a question that I raised in the Instacast, which was about the raining squid. We see Ozymandias in this episode. He was the one pulling the strings in the graphic novel, kind of the big mastermind behind all of the things that occurred, and in a way saved the world. In another way, massacred thousands of people. We get to see him again, played by Jeremy Irons, masterfully in this opening episode of Watchmen. Raining squid, Ozymandias' fault?
For those who don't know the backstory, this is the telltale. This is the smoking gun that tells us we're living in the universe that's left or that follows the comic book versus the movie. Because in the movie, he uses the atomic power, or he harnesses the power of Dr. Manhattan, where in the comic book, it's a big giant psychic squid, right?
Right. Adrian Veidt uses all of his technological advancements that he has spearheaded throughout the decades, and his team of biological researchers to create this sort of psychic squid creature. He uses technology to teleport this thing into the dead center of Times Square in New York. The technology isn't 100% there. Anything that he teleports instantly dies. So when he teleports this squid, its instant like death cry is this psychic scream that causes all of this death and destruction in this city. It's a very short jump to believe that after all of this comes to light due to Rorschach's journals and things, the government's quick to sweep in, scoop up any technological information that they can find a way to recreate this situation, these sort of trans-dimensional jumps with these strange raining squid, and frame this as an attack and further the narrative that this is an outside enemy that's secretly still plotting to come and get us.
Yeah, because I mean, so this is the way that the Cold War ended, right? After this devastation in New York City, it frightened the governments of the world, believing that this monster that, again, was genetically created by Adrian Veidt was supposed to be this alien from another dimension or a planet and sign of a possible future invasion. As a result, they decided to work together against that new threat, at least ending the Cold War and creating a seemingly worldwide peace, removing the inevitable threat of mankind's destruction by nuclear war. So that's really the main storyline or the main first play. Now, Veidt's world in the comic book lasts for 7 years. And as you said, King B, as part of this plan, there was an ongoing effort to ensure that people stayed fearful of this squid invasion or this attack. So it could be, as many have suggested, a government act to ensure that people stay within, their guardrails, or it could be just regular fallout from what Veidt created because his technology was so unreliable. And if you notice in the Watchmen, you have to kind of pause it. But there's a headline that reads, Boise squid shower destroys homeless camp, kills 2. So it's not just in Tulsa. It happens all over. And it's interesting because, as you said, these people are just frankly annoyed with the squids. And the squids don't seem to be lasting very long, right? They seem to kind of be melting right away. They die on impact and then just kind of melt away and they kind of smell. And there's governmental services that come in and clean this up. I wonder if this is also kind of an allegory for what is happening today. We talked about the white nationalism, but we talk about collective trauma. That collective trauma leads to a longer term impact on the attitudes and belief of those who grew up in that post-apocalyptic society. When we think of our current world, we currently live in America after, in a post 9/11 area, and that exposure to 9/11, researchers and scientists have theorized that these acts of terrorism leads to the perceived threats, political intolerance, prejudice, and xenophobia that we see in some American children. That's the world that is living in the Watchmen right now, right? Where all of the things that are happening with the Seventh Calvary could be a result of what the government tried to do in order to keep the peace afterwards.
Lots of really, really deep research. I appreciate both of you guys getting so far into these topics. We do have a couple other topics that people were asking about, really quick hits on these. So just a quick Q&A format as we wrap this up. Again, if you like to write in your questions to the podcast, go to host@shatontv.com. Or if you have any comments or things that we missed, please write us with your actually, or just something that you observed. But Raj, one of the first questions that we had was, in this world, we noticed that there is no internet, apparently no cell phones, and no gas-powered vehicles. What's up with that?
Yeah, this came from Twitter. Again, you can find us at Shat on TV on Twitter or our individual accounts. I had to confirm that there were no cell phones, and you guys actually talked about this in your preview episode. The closest thing that we see is Judd's beeper. In several tangible ways, the world of HBO's Watchmen is a better and more environmentally friendly pace than the world of the comic. And I think that may have to do with, the breakthroughs in renewable energy kind of after the Cold War ended, or maybe some of the technology that was left behind or being worked on by Dr. Manhattan. Again, this is supposed to be a remix. And if you notice in the movie, Dr. Manhattan is searching for clean, renewable energy. So perhaps they took that and lifted that but then you also, Robert Redford is a known environmentalist, and it would make sense that once he becomes president, that he would invest that. Maybe it's a Redford initiative. The internet, I had a little bit more struggle with. I don't know why there wouldn't be the internet in this world, because, I first thought that this could be a repercussion of no more Cold War, so no more investment in military spending. But the modern internet was created back in the 60s as a way for colleges and universities to connect with each other and share information. So the only thing that I can logically think of, and again, I don't know, this is just my guess, is this due to government control? Like in an authoritarian society similar to like North Korea or China?
My guess would be one of three things. One is that we know that movies were more fun to watch in the 80s before the internet was invented, because it was easier to write plot lines that way. Yeah. They're like, why doesn't somebody just call that guy on his cell phone? Why doesn't somebody just jump on the internet? Well, now you can't. So it's easier for the writers. I think that's one. Two is just because something was invented, like the internet, doesn't mean that it's inevitable, in the sense that if you change a world slightly, different outcomes might come out. Maybe the energy and resources they poured into alternative energy and the resources they turned into other issues may have prevented people from spending that same money and time on researching internet communication. And finally, just because there's an internet doesn't mean there's a World Wide Web. So it might just be that there's no cell phones, there's no World Wide Web, but the internet that existed in the 60s, that method of data transfer between universities, maybe that still exists.
And it could be that there's just no societal demand for it. If the entire world enters a stage of world peace due to this horrible traumatic event that affects everyone, maybe people don't want the news. And maybe they're grateful that the government stepped in and said, hey, we got this, just chill out and relax. So there's no demand for extra information. There's no desire to exchange new and different ideas. We're in a society that's just kind of accepted what is given to them, and there's no demand for something more.
The future is bright, as the sign says.
All right, next question that comes up, Raj, why is this show set in Tulsa, Oklahoma? So, of course, the graphic novel is set in New York City. Lots of stuff is set in New York City, especially comic book stuff. Here we get Tulsa, Oklahoma, kind of an outlier there, an unexpected setting for an HBO flagship series. What's up with that?
Yeah, so Tulsa has this tourist attraction called the Center of the Universe. Apparently, it's a phenomenon where if you stand in the middle of this circle and make a noise, the sound is echoed back to you several times louder than it was made, and no one else can hear you. You combine that with the 1921 riots, which allows for kind of this setting that we talked at great lengths of, where you're setting up the Seventh Calvary, you're setting up this idea of an area that has been impacted by major race riots in the past, and it allows for good storytelling. We see some of the previews for the upcoming season. There seems to be some people wanting to get to Tulsa, and I wonder if it's because of that phenomenon or that center of the universe thing. Or Oklahoma is featured well throughout this episode, right? You have the Oklahoma musical lyrics that are this episode title, right? It's summer and we're running out of ice. You could say that is kind of the end of the world, or our grip on this world is starting to thaw and we're in trouble. So yeah, lots of good allusions to Oklahoma. Very well done.
My father married a woman, his fourth marriage. His father-in-law shot him in the foot with a shotgun. And as a result, he doesn't have any bones in his right foot, or he's missing quite a few bones in his right foot. It happened in Oklahoma.
There's a keen scene that we pointed out in the Instacast where Don Johnson, in a very charming way, playing Judd, is singing Oklahoma. They point out that he tried out for a role in Oklahoma when he was younger. We get very little background on this guy before he ends up being hung and killed, presumably for standing up for what's right and showing his face in an environment where that's very dangerous. He does a couple of mysterious actions, during this episode. But one of the things we do see is a portrait of him and his father. The direction is very clear on this. The camera does stick on it for a while. Did you pick anything up from that?
I paused it. I took a screenshot of it. I lightened it, and it looks like his father is a Walmart version of Nicolas Cage. But other than that, I mean, the picture appears to be a young Judd with his father, who is also kind of a police chief. Based on the clothing, time period, and singing ability of Judd's character, it would suggest that he grew up in Oklahoma. With previous racial tensions high, the only thing that I can suggest is maybe this pick is alluding to a more nefarious hidden life, right? Because he lies to his wife. He says, I'm going to have one of the guys drive me, but that doesn't happen. He's driving himself. Maybe the picture points to kind of what is behind or what caused his deaths. I mean, again, your guess is as good as mine. I'd be interested to hear what your theories on that are.
Well, we do see him when he's in the Archimedes style flyer, which again, that was interesting too. The reaction to the Seventh Cavalry having an airplane was very extreme. They were like, "Holy shit, he's got an airplane!" Which you would think in the future, big deal, he got an airplane, but there's something going on there. So this Archimedes flyer that they're using, it was the ship that Pirate Jenny and Judd were in. It looks like an owl, and there's a reason for that. It looks exactly like Night Owl's flyer from the comic books. He seemed very eager to take that plane out of the sky.
He's willing to put their lives at risk. I mean, ultimately, I would bank on, hey, I'm going to die, but I'm going to make sure that I kill these people before I do. That strange behavior, the drugs, there's a lot of weirdness going on. If he was killed by Will Reeves, then I'm sure that he had some sort of nefarious history that had yet to be revealed.
We talked about rewatching this episode, and King B, you watched it a few times now. I've only watched it once, but I did rewatch this final scene because it was bugging me. Will Reeve, as you mentioned, Raj, asked about being able to lift 200 pounds or if Sister Night thought he could lift 200 pounds. Later, we see Don Johnson strung up and we think, oh, okay, well, Judd got hung. He's probably a guy that's about 200 pounds. Was Will suggesting that he was going to hang this man? And is he the one responsible for it? And I thought those pieces all seem to come together. But then when you really think about it, there's a lot of questions there. What would his motivation be? Why would he call Sister Night over and tell her, I know who you are, mention her father's name, say not to wear the mask, and then finally be sitting there with a woman who clearly has an affinity for the man that's dead? If he's the killer, why would he even do that? So I think that the more obvious response would be, who has the means, the organization, and the motivation to do this? Well, you see that his tires were intentionally deflated by a stop stick, sees this bright light in the night, and then he's hung up. It seems like the Seventh Cavalry would be the logical explanation. But again, there might be tons of other suspects we're not seeing here.
You may be right. It could be the Seventh Cavalry. It could be some individuals that he was working with from a nefarious perspective, because he was very keen on making sure that airplane didn't get away. Your guess is as good as mine at that point. But again, I love all these little mysteries that we're going to get a ton of theories for. And hopefully we'll learn. Hopefully these are answers that we're going to get throughout the season.
Yeah. And as a reminder to people who are joining us for the first time or people who've come back from other shows that we've done, whether it was Game of Thrones or Westworld, the writing in is really what helps us piece these mysteries together. I can't count how many times the audience listening and writing in to host@shadontv.com really cracked the case for us. We do often, have a good chuckle at the tinfoil when the theories are way out there. I think of the wild speculation, we're the most guilty of it right now. So you guys are in the clear. So write in what your thoughts are. Again, that's at host@shadontv.com. All right. Well, that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Watchmen. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatontv.com. You can email us at hosts@shatontv.com. And we're everywhere fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please be sure to give us a 5-star review. That helps the podcast grow. You know what? It doesn't even have to be 5 stars. Give us a review. It really helps a young podcast like ours grow, gets those numbers up. People right now are watching Watchmen for the first time. They're searching for a Watchmen podcast. And if we can get this high on their list, they'll give us a shot and they can find out the kind of quality programming we've been bringing you. Also, as a reminder, we are still doing Shat the Movies. Normally during TV season, we take a break from Shat the Movies so Raj, Big D, and I can focus on TV. In this case, we're pulling double duty, so the movies will be coming out. So if you haven't subscribed to Shat the Movies, please go to shatthemovies.com, check that out. And if you are a Shat the Movies listener, don't stop listening. We've got fresh stuff coming out every week. We're in the middle of the Shat the Movies Halloween Spooktacular. And after that, we've got tons and tons of great movies planned all the way through, I think, like January of 2020.
Yeah, it's insane. It's insane.
All right. On behalf of my co-host, Roger Roper and the King Bee, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us next week for Shat on TV Watchmen. Until then, thanks for listening and have a great night.